So now I'm thinking about this I think it was yesterday, I think it was at Brooklyn Tech High School, I believe. The students themselves organized a walkout demanding distance learning. I just thought, again, given what we know, the science around how this virus affects that age bracket, which is not a lot, especially this newest variant from the newest data that have come out. I mean, it's astounding, because what you're describing is, it's not that something is being inserted at this point. It's like the folks are making these decisions for themselves, in particular folks who have, so little risk. It's almost hard to actually quantify how little.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think it connects with another thing that I find very troubling, which we might call the cult of vulnerability. I mean, one of the wonderful things about youth is that you feel invulnerable. And we could argue about why, and the biologists could tell us and the psychiatrists could tell us what leads to this usual sense of invulnerability. And I'm sure there's many theories about it. But that's a beautiful thing in many ways. You're 19, you're going to eat the world, as they say in Spanish. And what happens, and what is happening in a society that seems to be inculcating a cult of vulnerability at the people who are most vigorous and who have been usually those most leading the charges toward vitality and the celebration of life and its possibilities. Wow, what does that do to a society? To have someone at the age of 19 looking in the mirror and seeing mostly a vulnerable person rather than a powerful one. And why are we doing this? Or how have we done this? Or how has this been done, to leave subjects out of it? I don't know about you, but I was brought up to try and learn to be as hardy as I could be in the face of life's difficulties. But it seems now there's almost a currency that is derived from presenting oneself as vulnerable. And it seems to be turning many things in reverse, and I'm troubled about it. And I wonder to the extent to which we are putting in the hands of others this ability to label, to put a label on us that speaks of vulnerability, when in fact, in clinical terms, there's no such vulnerability, and I can only think that benefits people who already have power. And I often think about this in the context of history. The feudal system in the Middle Ages, we think about it in general terms. Well, there was landowners and there was peasants. But the feudal system was a system that was rooted in the idea that the warrior landowner provides security for the vulnerable people. And the beginning of democracy and republicanism in the small r sense as we know it came when people said, I'm willing to take the risk of not being fully protected to express my individuality as a social subject. In other words, I'm not going to mortgage my freedom in the name of safety. And now this is what we seem to be doing. And it seems to be helped along by this semiotic game, this labeling game, that tells people that they can't do things until someone else allows them to, or until the stain is taken away from them. And it puts you in a very negative position vis-a-vis power. I mean, I think what's going on in some of these universities where you're having mass testing, and we know the testing is unreliable, and we're, in some places, confining students to their dorm rooms and bringing them bags of food and laying that at the door. Meanwhile, they're being charged $70,000 for this. What kind of training about the ability to go into life with hope is being is being given here.
Well, no, and I mean, you're right. It's just that the thing that strikes me is, you know, if this was a virus that actually created really significant risk for these people, I can imagine all sorts of dramatic, you know, so exceptions to social behavior that would make sense. I mean, I can imagine that. I wouldn't like it, but, you know, a lot of people, but it's just so, the behavior is so completely outside of the reality of the risk. And that's the part that I find so mind-boggling.
And the handing over of authority. So on the basis of this contrived sense of risk, you're handing over authority. Will that authority come back? Will you know how to reassume it, even if it is given back? To learn how to become authoritative in the broad sense in your own life is a life skill. How do you become imbued enough with your sense of self in the positive sense to manage your life? That's a skill you need to do. But what if you're always waiting from an authority figure outside yourself for the signal to do or not do something? And it would seem that we're training for a society of permanent infantilization in many ways. Infantilization, I mean, I don't know, sometimes now when I go on an airplane, the metronomic infantilizing announcements that I have to put up with throughout it, you go, are we idiots? Do we need to be reminded again? And you've got to ask yourself, why are these things being hammered at us? And there seems to be a presumption that we're incapable. If we didn't have these outside figures constantly telling us how to comport ourselves, that we wouldn't do so. Well, if you do that long enough, you begin to lose perhaps your instincts of how to comport yourself. And you begin looking out of the corner of your eye and saying, could someone please give me a signal as to how to act now? Instead of developing your inherent sense and skill in knowing how to act in a given situation.
Something that really struck me in another one of the pieces that you wrote was this. You made this distinction between with what you call humanistic thinking versus scientific thinking, kind of on being like on opposite sides of a spectrum, and that the concept of public health properly should kind of fit into some kind of a balance, a fine balance between these two areas. And then kind of what I read into it is that, you know, it unfortunately went all the way to one end. And this is part of our problem. So tell me about this.
It's in many ways, it's a broader problem that has existed at least since the onset of the modern university at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the model was science as the leading, and still to this day, probably the leading discipline. It was the most fast-moving area. And science, and I don't want to generalize too much, for the most part is based on analysis, which is the opposite of synthesis, right? Analysis is breaking something down into its constituent parts, and to get to finer, ever more fine elements of it to understand it on some level. You may then piece it back together and come up, and that would be the humanistic part of science. The humanistic side of things, which is where I work, is synthetic in nature, not in the sense of fake, but synthetic in the sense of engaging in synthesis. It's taking scraps of culture. Sure, we have to be analytical sometimes to find the pieces, but in the end, if we don't take the pieces we find and create a narrative that's coherent, it's not very useful as humanistic work.